A SWAT team wrongfully bursts into a black man's house, assuming he is a criminal. However, the SWAT team gets karma when they discover they have just destroyed an innocent man's house for no reason. Harold Jenkins sat in his favorite chair, the gentle glow of the TV casting flickering light across the quiet living room. His thoughts were miles away, focused on tomorrow's plans, visiting his granddaughter at school, picking up a new book from the store downtown. He relished these small moments of peace, the simplicity of his retirement. Then, everything exploded. The front door crashed inward with a deafening boom, wood splintering violently as it gave way. Harold barely had time to blink before black-clad figures stormed into the room. Rifles raised, lasers dancing across the walls. "Get on the ground! Now!" The command tore through the air like a crack of thunder. Harold's teacup slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor as his mind struggled to make sense of the chaos. He barely understood what was happening. Men in helmets, shields, weapons, shouting. It didn't belong here, not in his quiet home. "Get on the ground!" The voice came again, louder, closer, shaking the very walls. Harold's body reacted before his mind could catch up. Shaking, his heart hammering in his chest, he stumbled forward from his chair and dropped to his knees. The carpet scratched his knees as he tried to lie down, every movement slow, hesitant. He couldn't understand why. What was happening? Why were they here? Before he could settle fully on the floor, a boot slammed into his back, driving him down. Harold gasped as his chest hit the floor, the air knocked from his lungs. "Stay down!" The voice above him was full of authority. Anger even. It was a man's voice, sharp and impatient. Harold pressed his cheek into the carpet, his breath ragged as he fought to hold back a sob. "Are you Harold Jenkins?" The same voice demanded. Louder now, the boot still digging into his back. Yes," Harold managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where's the weapon? Where's the stash?" The voice barked, every word landing like a blow. Harold's mind spun. Weapon? Stash? What were they talking about? I don't have anything," Harold stammered. "There's nothing here, I swear." The boot lifted, but before Harold could move, rough hands grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. He winced, the pain shooting up his shoulders. Cold metal snapped around his wrists, and Harold flinched as the cuffs bit into his skin. "Don't move!" another voice ordered, though there was no need. Harold wasn't going anywhere. As he lay there, humiliated and terrified, he could hear the SWAT team fanning out through the house. Boots stomped across the floor, doors were thrown open, furniture scraped against the walls. Commander Darren Cole moved swiftly, his tactical gear weighing heavily on his shoulders as he swept through the narrow hallway of the house. Every room had to be cleared, every corner checked. The intel had been solid. A tip-off from an informant about a dangerous dealer using this address as a hideout. Cole had been on hundreds of raids like this before. The details blurred together in his mind, but the objective was always the same. Eliminate the threat, secure the target, and get out. But something felt off. "Clear!" an officer shouted from the back bedroom. Cole barely glanced over as he approached a closed door on the right. He kicked it open, splintering the frame as he stormed inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. A child's bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the walls lined with posters of cartoon characters. A pink backpack sat at the foot of the bed, still zipped shut. Cole's pulse quickened, but he didn't hesitate. He tore the backpack open, rifling through the contents. Clothes, books, pencils. Nothing illegal. No weapons. He moved to the closet, yanking the door open. Nothing. "Anything?" he barked into his comms. "Negative. Every room's empty," came the reply. Cole's jaw clenched. The tip-off had been specific. This house, this address. The guy was supposed to be armed and dangerous. He'd led his team in expecting a firefight, but so far all they'd found was this empty house and the old man lying on the floor in the living room. "Keep searching," he ordered, moving out of the room. His boots thudded against the hardwood floor as he passed through the kitchen, where more officers were tearing through cabinets, pulling out drawers, dumping their contents onto the counter. Plates and glasses shattered as they hit the ground, the sound almost drowned out by the clamor of voices. But there was nothing. No sign of anything illegal. No stashes hidden behind walls or under floorboards. Cole's gut twisted. They'd been here too long, and there was no sign of the threat they were supposed to neutralize. Harold lay still on the floor, listening to the destruction happening around him. Every crash, every bang, every thud of footsteps made him flinch. His heart felt like it might burst from his chest, his breath shallow and ragged. He heard voices from deeper in the house, officers calling out to each other, but he couldn't make out the words. He wanted to cry out, to plead with them to stop, but his throat was too tight. He could only lay there, helpless, face pressed into the rough carpet, his hands cuffed behind his back. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approached again. Heavier this time. The boot came off his back, and Harold dared to lift his head slightly, though his vision swam with tears. The officer standing over him knelt down, and before Harold knew what was happening, the cuffs were removed. "Sit up," the officer commanded. Harold pushed himself up slowly, his arms trembling from the strain. As he sat there on the floor, trying to catch his breath, the officer's voice came again, flat, emotionless. "We received a tip about a criminal living here," the officer said. "It seems we've made a mistake." Harold blinked, still dazed. A mistake. That's what this was. His mind struggled to comprehend the words. How could they call this a mistake after tearing his home apart, treating him like a criminal? Commander Cole appeared in the doorway, surveying the room. His gaze swept over the broken furniture, the scattered belongings, and finally, Harold, still sitting on the floor. For a brief moment, their eyes met, but Cole looked away quickly, as though he couldn't bear the sight of the man they'd just humiliated. Cole's radio crackled to life and he turned slightly, muttering something into the mic. Harold didn't catch the words. He felt numb, disconnected from everything around him. "Let's move," Cole ordered, his voice low but commanding. The officers began filing out of the house, their footsteps heavy as they moved through the wreckage they'd created. One by one they left, until Harold was alone in his living room, sitting amidst the destruction of his life. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the broken pieces of his home. The shelves had been emptied, books tossed carelessly onto the floor, picture frames shattered. A vase that once held fresh flowers from his garden was now a pile of ceramic shards. Slowly Harold stood, his knees aching from the strain. He moved to the mantel, where a family photo lay face down. He picked it up gently, turning it over to reveal the smiling faces of his late wife and his children. The glass was cracked, but the picture inside was still intact. Harold's hands trembled as he clutched the frame to his chest. A mistake. That's what they called this. But this was no mistake to him. It was a violation, an intrusion that had stripped him of his dignity, his sense of safety, and no amount of fixing doors or cleaning up the mess would change that. As he stood there, clutching the photo, the weight of what had happened began to settle in. He was no longer the man who could sit peacefully in his living room, enjoying his retirement. That man was gone, replaced by someone else, someone who had been torn down, broken by the very people who were supposed to protect him. The officers were gone, but their presence lingered, etched into the walls and floors of his home, and into Harold's heart. His life, like his house, would never be the same again. Harold sat on the driveway, a wool blanket draped over his shoulders, though it did little to warm him. He felt like he was outside himself, watching from a distance as paramedics hovered, checking his pulse, asking questions he barely heard. The cool evening air did nothing to calm the storm still raging inside him. Everything felt unreal. The flashing lights, the officers still milling around his home, the shattered pieces of his life scattered across the yard. A small crowd had gathered at the end of the driveway. Neighbors, curious onlookers, some holding up phones, recording everything. Whispers floated through the air, a low murmur that felt like a pressure building in Harold's ears. He wanted to scream, to make them all go away, but his voice seemed to be trapped somewhere deep inside, just like his breath. "Sir, are you feeling dizzy?" a paramedic asked, her voice gentle, too gentle, like she was talking to a child. Harold blinked at her, then shook his head slowly. "No," he murmured. His throat felt dry and tight, his words scratchy and weak. "Do you need anything?" "Water, maybe," she offered, but Harold just shook his head again. What did he need? What could they possibly give him to fix this? He looked past her, his gaze drifting back to the house. The front door hung crookedly on its hinges, the wood splintered and broken. Shards of glass from the windows glistened on the ground, twinkling mockingly under the streetlights. Inside, he could still see movement. Officers talking, gesturing, their faces serious, but they didn't look like they had any answers. As if on cue, a car screeched to a halt nearby, and Harold's heart skipped a beat. Michael. His son was out of the car before it had even fully stopped, his face a mask of panic and anger. He sprinted up the driveway, eyes wide as he took in the scene. "Dad! Dad, are you okay?" Michael's voice was a desperate cry as he reached Harold's side, kneeling down and taking his father's hands in his. He searched Harold's face, his own filled with fear and fury. "What happened? Are you hurt?" I'm fine," Harold whispered, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't fine. None of this was fine. But what else could he say? Michael's eyes roamed over Harold's hunched form, then darted to the paramedic. Was he hurt? Did they hurt him? His voice had an edge now, sharp and dangerous. "He's physically okay, just shaken up," the paramedic replied, glancing between Michael and Harold with cautious eyes. We're keeping an eye on him, making sure he's not in shock. Shock, Michael repeated, his voice rising. He stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. They kicked down his door, dragged him out here like a criminal. And you're worried about shock? Before anyone could respond, Michael turned, his eyes blazing as they locked onto the SWAT commander standing near the driveway. Darren Cole was speaking into his radio, his helmet off now, his expression grim. Michael stormed toward him, his steps quick and purposeful, the restrained fury radiating off him like heat. "What the hell did you do to my father?" Michael shouted, his voice cracking through the air. Heads turned, people drew closer, their phones still held high, capturing every second. Commander Cole glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Michael. "Sir, I need you to calm down," he began, his tone measured, almost condescending. "Calm down?" Michael's voice was incredulous. "You break into my father's house, terrorize him, tear everything apart, and you want me to calm down? We received a credible tip that a dangerous suspect was inside this residence," Cole said evenly. His gaze flicked briefly to Harold, still sitting on the ground, then back to Michael. "We had to act on that information." "A tip? That's all you had?" Michael stepped closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "You didn't bother to verify anything? You just burst in, guns blazing, and humiliate an old man in his own home?" Cole's jaw tightened, his expression hardening. "We followed protocol. The safety of the public is our top priority." Michael let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Safety? You call this safety?" He gestured wildly toward the house, toward his father, his voice breaking. "You call this protecting the public?" Cole's eyes flashed with something. Anger, frustration, but he kept his voice steady. "We're sorry for what happened to your father, but we were acting on reliable information." "Sorry?" Michael's voice was almost a roar now, drawing the attention of everyone around. "You think saying sorry is going to fix this? Look at what you did. Look at him." He pointed toward Harold, who was staring vacantly at the ground, his shoulders hunched, the blanket slipping from his back. Cole glanced over again, his face stony. "We're still investigating the tip that led us here. It was a mistake, but it was an honest one." "An honest mistake?" Michael's voice cracked, his hands shaking. "Do you even hear yourself? You could have seriously hurt him or worse. Do you understand that?" Cole's face darkened, but he took a step back, holding up his hands. "I understand that you're upset, but this isn't helping. We're trying to—" "No, you don't understand." Michael cut him off, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand because you don't have to live with this. You get to go home tonight and forget this ever happened, but my father—" He trailed off, his voice choked with emotion. Cole's gaze hardened. "I understand that this is difficult for you, but I have a job to do. We're doing everything we can to—" "To what?" Michael snapped. "To clean up the mess you made? To cover your asses so you don't have to admit you screwed up? Is that it?" "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," Cole said, his voice low, his posture shifting, tensing as if preparing for a fight. Michael took a step forward, his eyes blazing. "Or what? You going to arrest me too? Drag me off for daring to speak out after what you did?" Before the situation could escalate further, another officer stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Cole's arm. "Commander, we should go," he said quietly. "There's nothing more we can do here." For a moment it looked like Cole might argue, but then he nodded stiffly. He glanced once more at Harold, who still hadn't moved, and then back at Michael. "I'm truly sorry for what happened to your father," he said, his voice softer now, almost sincere. "If there's anything we can do, you've done enough," Michael spat. "Just get out." Cole hesitated, then turned away, his shoulders rigid. The officers began to file out, their gear clattering softly as they moved. Michael watched them go, his chest heaving, anger and helplessness swirling in his eyes. When the last of them had gone, he turned back to his father, his expression crumbling. He dropped to his knees beside Harold, his hands reaching out but stopping short of touching him, as if afraid he might break. "Dad," he whispered, his voice thick. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I got here as fast as I could." Harold looked up at him, his eyes tired, lost. He shook his head slowly, his voice a whisper. "It's not your fault, Michael. It's not your fault." Michael closed his eyes, swallowing hard. "We're going to make this right, okay? We're going to hold them accountable. They can't just do this." Harold's gaze drifted back to the house, to the shattered windows, the broken door. He felt so tired, so empty. "I just want to go inside," he said softly. "I want to go home." Michael nodded, his eyes wet with unshed tears. He helped his father to his feet, guiding him gently back toward the house. As they stepped through the broken doorway, the devastation inside hit Michael like a punch to the gut. The living room was unrecognizable, furniture overturned, books and papers strewn everywhere. pieces of glass and wood scattered across the floor. Harold stopped just inside the doorway, his shoulders slumping as he took it all in. "This was our home," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Your mother, we made this home." Michael's heart ached as he looked at his father, so small and fragile in the midst of the wreckage. "We'll fix it, Dad," he said quietly. "We'll fix everything." Harold nodded absently, his gaze still fixed on the broken pieces of his life. I don't understand. Why did they—" His voice trailed off, his eyes filling with tears. Michael wrapped an arm around his father's shoulders, holding him close. "I don't know, Dad," he whispered, "but we're going to find out. I promise." They stood there together, surrounded by the ruins of what had once been a sanctuary, and as the night deepened around them, the weight of what had happened settled over them both, heavy and suffocating. For Harold, the house no longer felt like home. It was just a shell, a place where everything he had built, everything he had cherished, had been torn apart in an instant. And no matter how many promises his son made, he knew that some things, some losses, could never be made right again. The morning sun filtered through the broken windows of Harold's house, casting fractured shadows across the floor. He sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling untouched in front of him. The house, usually filled with the comforting hum of daily life, was now silent and uneasy, every creak and groan a reminder of the chaos that had torn through it just hours ago. Michael moved through the kitchen, his presence agitated and restless. He was on the phone, pacing back and forth, his voice low but tense. "No, they had no warrant. They just burst in," he said, his tone sharp. "I don't care what the protocol says, they can't just do this. I want to file a formal complaint. Today." He glanced at his father, his eyes softening briefly before his expression hardened again. "Yes, I'll be there. 10 o'clock. He ended the call and took a deep breath, his jaw tight. He looked at Harold, who was staring blankly at his untouched coffee. "Dad, I'm going to the police station this morning. We're going to file a complaint against them." Harold didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the tabletop, the fine lines of the wood grain blurring as his mind drifted. The events of the night before played on a loop in his head. The shouting, the boots on his back, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He shuddered, his body tensing at the memory. "Dad?" Michael's voice broke through, pulling him back. He looked up, meeting his son's concerned eyes. "What?" Harold asked, his voice hoarse. "We're filing a complaint," Michael repeated gently. "Against the SWAT team. They had no right to do what they did." Harold shook his head slowly, a deep weariness settling over him. "I don't know, Michael. I don't want any more trouble." "It's not about causing trouble," Michael said, his voice tightening. "It's about holding them accountable. They can't just barge in like that, treat you like a criminal, and then walk away like it's nothing." Harold looked away, his eyes drifting to the shattered living room. The sunlight caught on shards of glass that still littered the floor, reflecting tiny pinpoints of light. It was all so overwhelming, so surreal. This wasn't his life, wasn't how things were supposed to be. "I'm tired, Michael," he murmured. "I just want things to go back to the way they were." Michael's face softened, and he moved closer, sitting down across from his father. "I know, Dad. I know you're tired, but you can't let them get away with this. If we don't do something, they'll just do it again, to someone else." Harold's eyes met his son's, and for a moment, he saw the fierce determination there, the anger and pain that mirrored his own. He knew Michael was right, but the thought of going through more questions, more scrutiny, more fear, was almost too much to bear. "I don't know if I can do it," Harold said quietly, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I have it in me." Michael reached across the table, covering his father's hand with his own. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. We can't let them think this is okay. You deserve better than this, Dad." Harold's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded slowly, squeezing Michael's hand. "Okay," he whispered. "We'll do it." Michael smiled, a tight, sad smile, and squeezed his father's hand back. "Thank you. It's going to be hard, but we're going to fight this." They sat there for a moment, holding on to each other, the silence heavy, but filled with a tentative hope. Michael's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "I have to go," he said reluctantly. "I'll be back this afternoon. We can go over everything then." Harold nodded, releasing Michael's hand. "Okay, be careful." Michael stood, grabbing his coat and keys. "I will. Try to get some rest, Dad." Harold watched him go, the front door closing softly behind him. The house fell silent again, and Harold was left alone with his thoughts, the echoes of the previous night still reverberating in his mind. Hours passed, and Harold wandered aimlessly through the house, the weight of the decision he'd made pressing down on him. He found himself in the living room, staring at the broken frames and toppled shelves, the books scattered across the floor, He bent down slowly, his joints aching, and picked up one of the books, an old photo album. Its cover worn and faded. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling. The pictures inside were a collage of memories. His children's first days of school, family vacations, birthdays. Each photo a snapshot of a life that had once felt whole, complete. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes misting as he traced the faces of his family. There was a photo of his wife, smiling brightly at the camera, her arm around a much younger Michael, both of them laughing. Harold's throat tightened as he looked at her face, her eyes so full of life. "I wish you were here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know what to do." He closed the album gently and set it back on the shelf, his hand lingering on its worn spine. The decision to fight felt enormous, overwhelming. But he knew Michael was right. If they did nothing, it was like saying it was okay, like saying he deserved what happened. And that was something he couldn't accept. When Michael returned later that afternoon, Harold was sitting on the couch, a look of quiet determination on his face. Michael took one look at his father and knew something had shifted. "Hey," Michael said softly, sitting down beside him. "How are you feeling?" Harold took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I want to do this, Michael. I want to file the complaint." Michael's face lit up with relief and pride. "Are you sure?" Harold nodded. "Yes, it's not just about me. It's about everyone they've done this to and everyone they might do it to if we don't stop them." Michael reached out and took his father's hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll do it together, Dad. I promise you. We'll fight this." Harold nodded again, his jaw set, his eyes bright with resolve. "Okay, let's do it." The next day, they sat in a small, cramped office at the police station, a young officer typing up their statement as Harold recounted what had happened. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor in his hands as he spoke, the words heavy and painful. Michael sat beside him, his presence solid and supportive, occasionally glancing at the officer with a fierce, protective look in his eyes. The officer nodded along, his expression tight and uncomfortable, typing quickly as Harold spoke. When it was over, the officer printed out the complaint and handed it to Harold. "You need to sign here, sir," he said quietly. Harold took the pen, his hand shaking slightly as he signed his name at the bottom of the page. As he set the pen down, he felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, anger, but also a sense of relief. It was a small step, but it was something. "Thank you," Michael said, his voice firm. "We'll be in touch." The officer nodded, and they left the station, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun. Harold blinked, his eyes adjusting to the light. He felt different, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Michael turned to him, his eyes shining with pride. "You did great, Dad." Harold smiled, a small, weary smile, but a real one. "We're just getting started," Michael nodded. "Yeah, we are, but we're in this together." They walked to the car, side by side, the first steps of their fight behind them, and so many more ahead. But for the first time since that terrible night, Harold felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could make things right again. And as they drove away from the police station, Harold looked out the window, his heart still heavy, but his spirit just a little bit lighter. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing worth fighting for ever was. But he wasn't alone. He had Michael. And together, they were going to take on this fight, one step, one day, one battle at a time. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Michael was relentless, throwing himself into the fight with a single-minded determination that both inspired and worried Harold. They spent hours at the law office, meeting with Michael's legal team, going over the details of the raid again and again. Today, they were back at Michael's office, a cramped room filled with stacks of case files and legal books. Harold sat at the small conference table, a thick folder of documents in front of him. His fingers trembled as he turned the pages, his eyes scanning the dense legal language that felt foreign and overwhelming. Michael paced back and forth, his phone glued to his ear, his voice low and urgent as he spoke to another lawyer on the team. "Yes, we need everything. Every report, every piece of evidence they have. I don't care how long it takes. We're going to need it all." He ended the call and looked at his father, his expression softening slightly. "How are you holding up, Dad?" Harold glanced up, giving a small, tired smile. "I'm okay. It's just a lot." Michael nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting down beside him. "I know, but we're making progress. We've got them on the back foot. The city doesn't want this going public." Harold's eyes flickered with uncertainty. What if they offer a settlement? Just to make it go away? Michael's jaw tightened. "They might, but we don't have to take it. This isn't just about money, Dad. It's about making sure they can't do this to anyone else." Harold nodded slowly, his gaze dropping back to the papers. "I know. I want to do the right thing. But I don't know what that is anymore." Michael reached out, resting his hand on his father's. The right thing is standing up to them, making them see that they can't treat people like this and get away with it. Harold looked at his son, seeing the fire in his eyes, the conviction that had driven him to fight for justice. You've always been so strong, Michael. Even when you were little, you never backed down. Michael smiled, a sad, proud smile. I learned that from you, Dad. You always stood up for what was right. Harold swallowed hard, the weight of his son's words settling over him. He felt a mix of pride and fear, knowing that this fight was bigger than just the two of them. But he also knew that he couldn't let Michael down. Okay, he said softly, let's keep going. That afternoon, they drove to the house, where Michael's legal team was waiting. They were gathering evidence, taking photographs of the damage the SWAT team had caused. Harold stood in the living room, watching as a young man with a camera methodically captured every broken piece of furniture, every shattered window, every scuff mark on the walls. The lawyer, a woman named Sarah, stood beside Harold, a clipboard in her hand. Mr. Jenkins, I know this is hard, but could you walk us through what happened? It's important that we have a clear picture of everything. Harold hesitated, his gaze lingering on the broken frame of a family photo lying on the floor. He felt a tightness in his chest, the familiar wave of anxiety washing over him, but he nodded, taking a deep breath. I was sitting in that chair, he began, pointing to the spot where his favorite armchair had been. It was now overturned, one of its legs snapped off. I was just watching TV. Then they broke in. His voice wavered, and Sarah nodded encouragingly. Take your time, Mr. Jenkins. They were shouting. I didn't know what was happening. I got on the floor like they said. He paused, his throat tightening. One of them, he stepped on my back. It hurt. I couldn't move. They kept shouting, asking about a weapon. But I didn't know what they were talking about. Sarah jotted down notes as he spoke, her expression serious but gentle. And then they started searching? Harold nodded, his eyes drifting to the hallway. They went everywhere, kicked in doors, pulled things out of closets. They broke everything. The photographer moved to the hallway, snapping pictures of the broken doors, the empty closets that had been ransacked. Harold watched him, his heart aching with every click of the camera. Did they say anything to you after they realized it was a mistake? Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Harold shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. They just said they were sorry, that it was a mistake. Like that made it okay. Sarah's eyes softened. I'm so sorry this happened to you, Mr. Jenkins. We're going to make sure they answer for this. Harold looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes, so much like Michael's. He nodded slowly, though a part of him still wondered if anything could really make this right. Back at the office later that evening, the team gathered to review the evidence they had collected. Michael stood at the front of the room, a projector displaying the photos of Harold's home on the wall behind him. We have everything we need to show that the SWAT team acted recklessly, Michael said, his voice strong and confident. They destroyed property, terrorized my father, and all without a shred of evidence to back up their actions. Sarah nodded, flipping through her notes. We've also pulled records of similar incidents. This isn't the first time they've raided the wrong house. We can establish a pattern of negligence. Michael's eyes flashed with anger. Good. We're going to show them that this isn't just one mistake. It's part of a larger problem. We need to make them see that they can't keep getting away with this. Harold listened quietly, his heart heavy with a mix of hope and fear. He appreciated Michael's passion, his drive to hold the police accountable. But a part of him worried about what it would cost, emotionally, financially, in ways he couldn't even imagine yet. What happens next? He asked, his voice steady but quiet. Michael turned to him, his expression softening. We'll file the lawsuit officially, then we start building our case. We'll call witnesses, gather more evidence, and prepare for trial. Harold nodded slowly. And if they try to settle? Michael's jaw tightened. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but I want them to face a jury. I want them to explain, in front of everyone, why they thought it was okay to do what they did. Harold felt a surge of pride for his son, for the strength and courage he showed. But he also felt the weight of what they were up against. The city, the police, the system that seemed so much bigger and stronger than them. But they had to try. For Michael, for himself, for everyone who had ever been treated like he had. They had to try. Later, when they were back home, Harold sat alone in the quiet living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He felt tired, more tired than he had in a long time. But there was also a spark inside him, a determination that had been buried for so long, finally beginning to surface again. He thought of Michael, of the fierce look in his eyes as he spoke about justice, about making things right. He thought of the young lawyer, Sarah, and her calm assurance that they could win this fight. And he thought of himself, of the man he used to be, strong, sure, unafraid to stand up for what was right. Maybe that man wasn't gone after all. Maybe he was still there, beneath the fear and the pain and the doubt. Harold took a deep breath, his eyes closing briefly as he let the air fill his lungs, then released it slowly. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he couldn't let fear stop him. Not now. Not when they had come this far. He would fight. For himself. For Michael. For everyone who had ever been made to feel small and powerless. He would fight, and he would win, because he had to. And as he sat there, alone in the quiet of his home, Harold Jenkins felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A flicker of hope, small but steady, burning bright in the darkness. They were just getting started. The courtroom buzzed with a hushed tension as Harold Jenkins sat quietly beside his son Michael. The room was filled with reporters, their pens and cameras poised, ready to capture every moment of the trial. Rows of spectators, some supporters, some merely curious, whispered amongst themselves, their eyes fixed on Harold. He felt their gaze like a weight on his shoulders, but kept his focus forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Michael leaned over, his voice low and steady. "Are you okay, Dad?" Harold nodded, though his heart was racing. "I'm fine," he whispered back. "Just nervous." Michael gave him a reassuring smile. "We've got this. Just tell the truth, and let me handle the rest." Harold nodded again, taking a deep breath. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the opposing table. Commander Cole sat there, his face a mask of stoic composure, surrounded by his legal team. Harold felt a flicker of anger, but it was quickly smothered by the nervous energy coursing through him. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Everyone rose as she took her seat, then sat down again in unison, the sound of shuffling feet and creaking chairs filling the air. "This court is now in session," the judge announced, her voice firm and steady. "We will begin with opening statements." Michael stood, buttoning his jacket before stepping confidently to the center of the room. He glanced at Harold, then turned to face the jury, his expression calm but intense. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice clear and strong, "we are here today because of a grave injustice. My father, Harold Jenkins, a retired teacher and a respected member of his community, was subjected to a brutal and reckless raid by the SWAT team, an action based on nothing more than an unverified tip. No evidence, no proper investigation, just a violent intrusion into his home, leaving him traumatized and his property destroyed." He paused, letting his words sink in. The jurors' faces were a mix of curiosity and concern, their eyes flicking between Michael and Harold. "My father did nothing wrong. He was not a criminal, not a threat, but he was treated as one. The SWAT team violated his rights, his dignity, and his sense of safety, all because they didn't do their due diligence." Michael took a step closer to the jury box, his voice lowering slightly. "This isn't just about my father. It's about the way our system fails people like him, people who are seen not as individuals, but as potential threats based on nothing more than an address or a name." He straightened, his gaze sweeping the room. "We are here to hold the SWAT team accountable for their actions, to show that what happened to my father was not just a mistake, but a result of systemic negligence and disregard for basic human rights." He nodded once, then returned to his seat. Harold watched him, a swell of pride mingling with the anxiety tightening his chest. Michael had always been good at speaking, clear, passionate, unwavering. Today, he was all of those things and more. The defense attorney stood next, a tall man with a polished demeanor. He strode to the center of the room, his movements deliberate, his expression carefully neutral. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and confident, "this case is indeed unfortunate. No one here disputes that what happened to Mr. Jenkins was upsetting. But we must remember that law enforcement officers have a duty to protect the public, often under difficult and dangerous circumstances. They acted on what they believed to be credible information, with the intention of safeguarding the community." He gestured toward Commander Cole, who sat motionless, his face unreadable. Commander Cole and his team were operating under extreme pressure, responding to a serious threat. They made decisions based on the information they had at the time. It is easy to criticize those decisions in hindsight, but we must judge their actions within the context of their duty to protect. The attorney's gaze shifted to the jury. "We ask that you consider the challenges faced by these officers and recognize that while the outcome was regrettable, it was not the result of malicious intent or gross negligence." He offered a sympathetic smile, then returned to his seat. Harold felt a flicker of doubt, a small voice in his mind whispering that maybe they were asking for too much. But then he looked at Michael, saw the determination in his eyes, and the doubt melted away. The judge turned to Michael. "You may call your first witness." Michael stood, his expression serious. "We call Harold Jenkins to the stand." Harold's heart jumped. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, the reality of it struck him like a blow. He rose slowly, his legs feeling unsteady, and made his way to the witness stand. The room seemed to hold its breath as he was sworn in, then sat down, his hands gripping the edges of the seat. Michael approached, his eyes gentle. "Dad, can you tell the court what happened on the night of the raid?" Harold swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He glanced at the jury, then back at Michael, his voice trembling slightly as he began. "I was sitting in my living room watching TV. It was quiet, just a normal evening." He paused, taking a deep breath. Then, suddenly, the door, it just exploded. There was this loud crash and these men, officers, stormed in. They were shouting, pointing weapons at me. I didn't know what was happening." He blinked, his vision blurring as the memory washed over him. "They told me to get on the ground. I was so scared. I didn't understand why they were there. I did what they said, but one of them, he stepped on my back. I couldn't breathe. They were shouting, asking about a weapon, about substances, but I didn't know what they meant. I didn't have anything." His voice broke, and he glanced down, his hands trembling. He felt the eyes of the room on him, but he pushed through, his voice steadier as he continued. "They tore through my house. They broke doors, threw things around. I just lay there on the floor, listening to them destroy everything. And then, after all that, they said it was a mistake, that they were sorry. But it didn't feel like enough. It wasn't enough." Michael's voice was gentle, but firm. "How did that experience affect you, Dad?" Harold closed his eyes, the pain and fear still raw, still fresh. I don't feel safe anymore. In my own home, I can't sleep. I keep thinking they're going to come back, that they'll make another mistake." He looked at Michael, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "They took away my peace. My home doesn't feel like home anymore." Michael nodded, his face tight with emotion. "Thank you, Dad." The defense attorney approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm very sorry for what happened to you. But can you confirm that the officers didn't physically harm you beyond restraining you?" Harold frowned, his mind struggling to process the question. "I wasn't hurt badly, no, but it wasn't just about being hurt. It was the way they treated me, like I was, like a criminal?" The attorney interjected, his tone calm. "Mr. Jenkins, the officers were following protocol in a high-risk situation. They believed there was a dangerous individual inside. Do you understand that they were acting to protect the community?" Harold's jaw tightened. "I understand they have a job to do, but they didn't treat me like a person. They didn't even check if they had the right house before they broke in. They just assumed." The attorney nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I understand, Mr. Jenkins, but isn't it true that the officers apologized once they realized their mistake?" Harold's eyes narrowed. "They said sorry, but it didn't change what they did. Saying sorry didn't make it okay." The attorney nodded again, then returned to his seat. No further questions. Harold felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him as Michael stepped forward again. "No more questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "You may step down, Mr. Jenkins." Harold stood, his legs trembling slightly as he made his way back to his seat. Michael squeezed his shoulder as he sat down, his eyes filled with pride and something else, something fierce and protective. "You did great, Dad," Michael whispered. "You were perfect." Harold gave a small, tired smile, but his heart was heavy. He had done his best, but he wasn't sure if it would be enough. He looked at Commander Cole, who was watching him with an unreadable expression, and felt a pang of anger and fear. The rest of the day passed in a blur of testimonies and cross-examinations. Michael called several witnesses, neighbors who had heard the raid, experts who spoke about the psychological impact of such incidents. The defense countered with their own witnesses, officers who testified about the dangers they faced, the split-second decisions they had to make. By the end of the day, Harold felt drained, his mind spinning with everything he had heard. He watched as the judge adjourned the court, as people began to file out, their voices low and murmuring. Michael was packing up his papers, his face set and determined. "We're making progress," he said, glancing at his father. "They're trying to paint this as just a misunderstanding, but we're showing the jury what really happened." Harold nodded, though he felt uncertain. "I just want it to be over," he said quietly. "I want to go home and not feel afraid." Michael's eyes softened. "I know, Dad, and we're going to get there, one step at a time." They gathered their things and left the courthouse, stepping out into the cool evening air. Reporters clustered around, their voices a cacophony of questions and cameras flashing. Michael answered a few, his voice calm and composed, then guided his father through the throng, shielding him from the barrage of attention. As they drove home, Harold stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. He felt tired, bone deep, the events of the day weighing heavily on him. But there was also a small flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were making a difference. When they finally reached home, Michael helped him inside, his presence a steadying force. Harold sat down in his favorite chair, the room quiet around him. "You did really well today, Dad," Michael said softly, sitting down beside him. "I'm proud of you." Harold nodded, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "Thank you, Michael. I couldn't do this without you." Michael smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made Harold's heart ache with love. "We're in this together, Dad, and we're going to win." Harold leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. It had been a long, hard day, but they had taken a step forward. They were fighting, and that meant something. As he drifted off to sleep, Harold felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with challenges, but he wasn't alone. They were going to see this through, no matter what. The courtroom felt colder as the defense took their turn. The atmosphere was charged, the air heavy with anticipation and unease. Harold sat beside Michael, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest of his chair. He had told his story, laid bare his fear and humiliation, but now it was their turn. The defense, the SWAT team's chance to justify what they had done. Michael leaned closer, his voice a soft murmur. "Remember, Dad, whatever they say, just stay calm. They're going to try to twist things, make it seem like they had no choice. But we know the truth." Harold nodded, though his heart was pounding. He glanced across the room at Commander Cole, who was talking quietly with his attorney. The man looked composed, his expression serious, but calm. Harold wondered what it would feel like to be so sure of yourself, even when you'd done something so terribly wrong. The defense attorney, a tall, stern-looking man named Adams, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we'd like to begin by calling Commander Darren Cole to the stand." Harold's stomach clenched as he watched Cole rise and make his way to the witness stand. The commander moved with a confident, almost casual grace, as if he belonged there, as if he were simply doing his job. He took the oath, then settled into the chair, his eyes focused and steady. Adams stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. "Commander Cole, can you please describe your role in the events of the night in question?" Cole nodded, his voice clear and steady. "Yes, I was leading the SWAT team that night. We had received credible information that a high-level dealer, known to be armed and dangerous, was hiding out at the address we were given." "And what was your primary concern when executing the raid?" Adams asked. "Our primary concern was the safety of the public and our officers," Cole replied. "We had to act quickly to apprehend the suspect before he could harm anyone or escape." Adams nodded thoughtfully. "And did you have any reason to believe that the suspect was not at the location provided?" Cole shook his head. "No, we didn't. The information we had was from a reliable source, and there was no indication that the suspect had left the premises. So, you believed you were acting in the best interests of public safety?" "Yes," Cole said firmly. "We were acting on the information we had at the time. Our goal was to neutralize a potential threat to the community." Harold felt his anger rising. He wanted to shout, to tell the jury that this man was lying, that there had been no threat, no danger, only his quiet home and his own fear. But he held his tongue, his jaw clenched tightly. Adams continued, "Can you describe the situation when you entered the house? Did anything happen that made you believe the suspect was present?" "There were no visible signs of the suspect," Cole admitted. "But we had to proceed cautiously. We didn't know if there were weapons hidden or if the suspect was preparing an ambush." "And what happened when you encountered Mr. Jenkins?" Cole's expression shifted, a flicker of something, regret maybe, crossing his face. "Mr. Jenkins complied with our orders. He got down on the ground as instructed. It was only after we had secured the area that we realized we had the wrong individual." "Did you, at any point, intend to cause harm to Mr. Jenkins?" Adams asked, his voice smooth, almost soothing. "No," Cole said, his voice firm. "Our intention was never to harm anyone. We were there to apprehend a dangerous suspect. The situation was unfortunate, but we followed protocol." Harold's hands tightened on the armrest. Protocol. That word felt like a slap in the face. A dismissal of everything he had gone through, everything they had taken from him. Adams turned to the jury, his expression serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, the officers acted in good faith, based on the information they had. They were trying to protect the community, to prevent harm. It is easy to criticize these decisions after the fact, but in the moment, they believed they were doing what was necessary." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We must not judge these officers too harshly for actions taken in the heat of a dangerous situation. They are not infallible, but they are dedicated to protecting us, often at great personal risk." He turned back to Cole. "No further questions." Michael stood, his face a mask of calm determination. "Commander Cole, you said you were acting on reliable information. Can you tell us more about this source?" Cole hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Michael to pounce. "Was this source known to you personally? Had you worked with them before?" Cole's jaw tightened. The source was an informant we've used in the past. Michael nodded, his eyes narrowing. And how often has this informant been accurate in providing information? Cole shifted in his seat. The informant has been mostly reliable. Mostly? Michael raised an eyebrow. So there have been instances where the information was not accurate. Cole's lips pressed into a thin line. There have been a few instances, yes. Michael stepped closer, his voice rising slightly. So you acted on information from a source that had previously given you inaccurate details, without any additional verification, and conducted a violent raid on my father's home. Cole's face flushed. We believed the information to be credible at the time. We didn't have time to what? Check? Verify? Michael cut him off, his voice sharp. You didn't have time to make sure you weren't going to destroy the life of an innocent man? Objection, Adams called, his voice ringing through the room. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained, the judge said, giving Michael a warning look. Mr. Jenkins, please refrain from interrupting the witness. Michael nodded, taking a deep breath. I apologize, Your Honor. He turned back to Cole, his voice calmer, but still edged with steel. Commander Cole, did you apologize to my father after you realized you had made a mistake? Cole's face tightened. I did. And did you at any point offer to help him with the damages to his home, or the trauma he experienced? Cole looked away briefly, then back at Michael. No, I didn't. That's not part of our protocol. Not part of your protocol, Michael repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. So, you can kick down doors, terrorize innocent people, but apologizing and making amends isn't part of your job. Objection. Adams was on his feet again. Counsel is editorializing. Sustained, the judge said firmly. Mr. Jenkins, please stick to the facts. Michael nodded, his gaze locked on Cole. Commander Cole, do you understand the impact your actions had on my father? Cole's eyes flashed with something. Anger, maybe frustration, but he kept his voice steady. I understand that it was a difficult experience for him. A difficult experience, Michael repeated softly. No further questions. Cole stepped down, his face a rigid mask as he returned to his seat. Michael watched him go, his jaw tight. Harold reached out, touching his son's arm. You did good, Michael, he said quietly. You made them see. Michael nodded, though his eyes were dark with frustration. I just hope it's enough. The defense called more witnesses, officers who had been part of the raid, experts who spoke about the dangers of their work. They painted a picture of a team under pressure, making split-second decisions to protect the community. Harold listened, his heart heavy. He could see what they were trying to do, could see how they were framing the events as an unfortunate necessity, but he couldn't forget the fear, the pain, the sense of violation that had stayed with him since that night. The defense rested, and the court adjourned for the day. As they left the courtroom, Michael put a protective arm around Harold's shoulders. We're not done yet, Dad, he said, his voice low but fierce. They're trying to make it seem like they had no choice, but we're going to show them they did. Harold nodded, though a part of him still felt uncertain, still wondered if they were asking too much, pushing too hard. But then he remembered that night, the way he had felt like a criminal in his own home, and the doubt faded. They were fighting for more than just themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter, like they were less than human. And no matter what, they weren't going to back down. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable as everyone waited for the jury to return. Harold sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting on his lap, fingers intertwined. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. Beside him, Michael sat still, his face set in a mask of calm, though his eyes were sharp and focused. It had been a long, grueling trial, filled with emotional testimonies and heated arguments. Harold had relived that night over and over again, each detail a painful reminder of the fear and humiliation he had endured. Now, after everything, they were moments away from knowing whether it had all been worth it. Michael reached over and gave his father's hand a reassuring squeeze. No matter what happens, Dad, I'm proud of you. You stood up for yourself, for all of us. Harold nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He glanced around the room, seeing familiar faces, friends and neighbors who had come to support him, their expressions tense with anticipation. Across the aisle, the defense team sat huddled together, Commander Cole in the center, his face impassive. Harold couldn't read his expression, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and the jurors filed in, their faces unreadable. Harold's stomach twisted as they took their seats, each one carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. The judge entered next, and everyone rose, then sat again as she took her seat. The jury has reached a verdict, the judge announced, her voice steady. Will the foreperson please stand and read the verdict? A middle-aged woman stood, a piece of paper trembling slightly in her hand. She cleared her throat, glancing down at the paper before speaking. In the case of Jenkins versus the city and the police department, we, the jury, find the defendants liable for the damages caused to Mr. Jenkins. Harold felt his breath catch, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned to Michael, who was smiling, a broad, relieved smile that lit up his entire face. The foreperson continued, her voice stronger now. We award Mr. Jenkins damages in the amount of $3,500,000. A murmur swept through the courtroom, a mix of gasps and whispers. Harold felt a rush of emotions, relief, disbelief, and something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time, validation. They had won. They had been heard. Michael turned to him, his eyes shining. We did it, Dad, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We did it. Harold nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. He felt a strange, almost surreal lightness, as if the weight he had been carrying for so long had suddenly lifted. He looked over at the defense table, where Commander Cole sat, his expression tight and unreadable. Adams, the defense attorney, was already on his feet, speaking to the judge. Your Honor, we respectfully request that the damages be reduced. The amount awarded is excessive given the circumstances. Michael was on his feet in an instant. Your Honor, the jury has spoken. Mr. Jenkins has suffered significant emotional and psychological harm due to the actions of the defendants. The amount awarded is not excessive but appropriate, given the impact this has had on his life. The judge held up a hand, silencing them both. I will consider the request and make a ruling. For now, this court is adjourned. The gavel struck, and the room erupted into noise. Reporters rushing forward, spectators whispering excitedly, cameras flashing. Michael helped Harold to his feet, guiding him toward the door as the crowd pressed in around them. Mr. Jenkins, how do you feel about the verdict? A reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward him. Harold blinked, overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught. Michael stepped in front of him, shielding him from the chaos. My father has no comment at this time, he said firmly, his arm around Harold's shoulders. Please give us some space. They pushed through the throng, finally emerging into the relative calm of the courthouse hallway. Harold took a deep breath, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. You okay, Dad? Michael asked, his voice soft with concern. Harold nodded slowly. I think so. It's just a lot to take in. Michael smiled, squeezing his father's shoulder. I know, but we did it. You stood up to them, and you won. Harold felt a swell of pride and gratitude. He looked at his son, seeing not just the fierce advocate who had fought for him in court, but the boy he had raised, the man he had always hoped Michael would become. Thank you, Michael, he said quietly. I couldn't have done this without you. Michael's smile widened, a flash of boyish pride in his eyes. I'm just glad you're okay, Dad. That's all that matters. They drove home in silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. As they pulled into the driveway, Harold felt a pang of anxiety. The house still bore the scars of that terrible night, the broken doorframe, the shattered windows that had been hastily boarded up. The sight of it all brought the memories flooding back, the fear and confusion, the sense of being utterly powerless. Michael parked the car and turned to him. We'll get it all fixed, Dad. This is just the beginning. We're going to make things right. Harold nodded, though a part of him wondered if things could ever truly be right again. Money wouldn't bring back his sense of safety, his peace of mind, but it was something. A recognition of the wrong that had been done to him, and that, at least, was a start. They stepped inside, the air thick with the musty scent of dust and disuse. Harold moved slowly, his eyes scanning the damage that still marred the walls and floors. He felt a pang of sadness, but also a spark of determination. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he would not let what happened define it, or him. We should get someone in to start the repairs, Michael said, his voice thoughtful. And maybe a security system, cameras, alarms, whatever you need to feel safe. Harold glanced at him, surprised by the suggestion. A security system? Michael nodded. Yeah, I don't want you to feel scared anymore. I want you to know that you're safe here. Harold felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized how deeply the fear had taken root, how it had colored every moment since that night. But Michael saw it, and that simple act of kindness, of wanting to protect him, meant more than any court verdict ever could. That sounds like a good idea, Harold said softly. Thank you, Michael. Michael smiled, the tension easing from his face. We'll get through this, Dad, one step at a time. They spent the rest of the day making plans, repairs to the house, security measures, even a trip Harold had always wanted to take, but had never felt brave enough to plan. As the sun set, casting a warm glow through the broken windows, Harold felt something shift inside him, a small, tentative hope, like a seed just beginning to sprout. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, Harold looked around at the familiar space. the scattered books and pictures that had been his life's backdrop for so many years. It was still his home, still filled with the echoes of laughter and love that no amount of violence could erase. He turned to Michael, his heart full. "I'm proud of you, son. You fought for me. You made them see me." Michael's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I just did what you taught me, Dad. You always told me to stand up for what's right." Harold smiled, a deep, genuine smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I'm glad you remembered." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the house quiet around them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Harold felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but they had come this far, and they would keep going. And as he sat there, his son beside him, the weight of the past months seemed to lift, just a little. He wasn't healed. Not yet, but he was beginning to believe that healing was possible. He looked around his home, the place that had been the heart of his life for so many years, and saw not just the damage, but the possibility of repair, of renewal. They would fix the broken doors, the shattered windows. They would rebuild, stronger than before, because that's what you did when something tried to break you. You stood up, you fought back, and you rebuilt. One step, one day, one brick at a time. They had won the verdict, but more importantly, they had won their dignity, their voice, their right to be seen and heard. And that, Harold knew, was something worth fighting for. The house felt different, even though the repairs had been completed. New windows replaced the ones shattered during the raid. The doors were solid again, the walls freshly painted, covering the scars that had once marked them. But Harold knew that appearances could be deceiving. Just because something looked whole didn't mean it was. Harold stood in the middle of the living room, his eyes scanning the space. It was strange how familiar everything seemed, yet how alien it felt. The newness of it all, a pristine, undisturbed facade, only served to highlight the disquiet within him, a dissonance he couldn't shake. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of that night, the crash of the door, the shouts, the feel of the cold, hard floor against his skin. He tried to push the memories away, to think of anything else, but they clung to him like shadows. He turned slowly, his eyes falling on the photograph that now sat on the newly repaired mantel. It was a picture of him and his late wife, taken on their 40th wedding anniversary. They were smiling, holding hands, their faces alight with happiness. He remembered that day vividly, the warmth of the sun, the laughter of their children, the way his wife's hand felt in his, soft and strong. "I wish you were here," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to do this without you." The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It felt too quiet, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the silence. He had thought that winning the case would bring him peace, but it hadn't. If anything, it had only made the emptiness more profound, the loneliness more acute. The settlement money sat in his bank account, untouched. Michael had suggested using it to travel, to take a vacation somewhere far away from the memories that haunted him. But the thought of leaving, of stepping outside the fragile safety of his home, filled him with an inexplicable fear. A knock on the door startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. His heart lurched, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he was back there again, on the floor, the boot pressing down on his back, the shouts ringing in his ears. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, to remember where he was, that he was safe. The knock came again, softer this time. "Dad, it's me." Michael's voice. Harold let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He crossed the room slowly, his steps measured, and opened the door. Michael stood on the porch, his face lined with concern. "Hey," Michael said softly, "I brought dinner. Thought we could eat together." Harold nodded, stepping back to let his son in. "Thank you, Michael. That sounds nice." They moved to the kitchen, where Michael began unpacking takeout containers. The familiar smells of fried chicken and mashed potatoes filled the air, a comforting scent that reminded Harold of family dinners and Sunday afternoons. They ate in silence for a while, the clink of cutlery the only sound between them. Harold picked at his food, his appetite gone, though he tried to hide it for Michael's sake. "You're not eating much, Dad," Michael said gently, his eyes full of worry. "Are you feeling okay?" Harold forced a smile. "I'm fine, just not very hungry," Michael set his fork down, his expression serious. "Dad, I'm worried about you. You've barely left the house since the trial ended. I know this has been hard, but you can't keep isolating yourself like this." Harold looked away, his chest tightening. "I don't know what to do, Michael. I thought winning would make it better, but I still feel scared all the time." Michael reached across the table, his hand covering Harold's. "It's okay to feel that way, Dad. What you went through was traumatic. It's not something you can just get over." Harold's eyes filled with tears, and he looked down, ashamed of his own weakness. I just want to feel normal again. I want to be able to sleep without waking up in a panic, without feeling like they're going to come back. Michael's grip tightened, his voice steady and full of love. You don't have to do this alone, Dad. There are people who can help, therapists, support groups. There's no shame in asking for help. Harold shook his head, his voice trembling. I don't know if I can talk about it. Not again. It's too hard. Michael nodded, his eyes soft. I understand, but it's a process, Dad. Healing takes time, and it's okay to take small steps. Maybe just talk to someone once. See how it feels. You don't have to commit to anything. Harold hesitated, his heart aching with the fear and confusion that had plagued him for so long. But he saw the hope in Michael's eyes, the love and concern, and something in him shifted. Maybe, he whispered, the word feeling foreign and tentative on his tongue. Maybe I'll try. Michael's smile was gentle, his relief palpable. That's all I'm asking, Dad. Just try. They finished dinner in a companionable silence, and afterward, they sat together in the living room, the television playing softly in the background. Harold leaned back in his chair, the familiar creak of the old wood a comforting sound. Michael sat beside him, flipping through channels, his presence a steady, reassuring comfort. You know, I've been thinking, Michael said after a while, his voice casual. What if we took a trip? Just the two of us. Maybe go to the coast. Get some fresh air. It doesn't have to be far, just a change of scenery. Harold's first instinct was to say no, to retreat back into the safety of his home. But then he thought of the endless, sleepless nights, the days spent staring at the same walls, the crushing weight of fear that never seemed to leave him. A trip, he said slowly, as if testing the idea. I don't know, Michael. I haven't been anywhere in so long. I know, Michael said softly, but maybe that's why we need to do it. Just get out of the house, see something new. You don't have to decide right now, but think about it, okay? Harold nodded, his mind spinning with the possibilities. It seemed daunting, almost impossible, but maybe, just maybe, it was a step he needed to take. For himself, for his son, for the chance to feel alive again. I'll think about it, he said quietly. And he saw the hope in Michael's eyes, the flicker of something brighter than the shadows that had clung to them for so long. That night, Harold lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, the darkness thick and heavy around him. But something was different. The fear was still there, lurking at the edges of his mind. But it didn't feel as suffocating. Michael's words echoed in his ears, a soft, steady reassurance that he wasn't alone. He turned onto his side, his eyes drifting to the small clock on his bedside table. It was past midnight, and though his body was tired, his mind was still racing, replaying the conversation with Michael, the tentative plans they had made. He thought about the trip, the idea of leaving the house, of stepping out into the world again. It scared him, more than he wanted to admit. But it also sparked a tiny flicker of excitement, a sense of possibility that he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, he thought, as he closed his eyes, maybe it was time to take that step, to try, to heal. The road ahead was still long, still fraught with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, Harold felt a small, fragile hope growing inside him, and that was something. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he dreamed of the coast, of waves crashing against the shore, of the sun rising over the horizon, casting its light across the water. He dreamed of peace, of healing, of the possibility of finding himself again, one step at a time. And in the quiet darkness of his room, for the first time in months, Harold slept without fear.